Welcome back, friends and fellow philosophers, to the philosophy of writing. We are on the philosophy of grammar. This is the fourth lecture, numbered number 3, because I neighbored again. 2 neighbors. Numbered the first one 0, because we're laying the groundwork. Before we jump in, we'll do a quick recap of what we've gone through. So we've covered what philosophy is and what it isn't. It's the rational pursuit of the truth as opposed to any type of dogma or doctrine, no matter how much Confucius wants his doctrine to be the one true doctrine. We then went into the philosophy of language, comparing it to the scientific method. When we are, let's say, using language to construct our ideas, we're doing the same thing that you're doing when you're making an experiment. We went into the philosophy of diction after that. So it's the choice of words and how, let's say, what significance, that's the right way to start that, what significance your choice of words has on how you conceptualize the world, and let's say how you can choose, or in fact, perhaps not even choose, your construction of words is determined by both how sincere you're being when you're encapsulating your idea and also how sincere you're able to be. So you have to start by, let's say, calling things by their true names, as Confucius said, in order to get your idea set up right with the universe and for things to work out for you. And now we're at the philosophy of grammar. Let's go ahead to the next one. So for this one, I have this big quote here from Richard Mitchell. I really liked this. I came upon him by accident and actually need to get one of his old textbooks and read it. I haven't had the chance, but this quote was amazing to me. So he says, "Some minds, at some point, discover that they cannot make sense of their own predications without attention to grammar, although they do not ordinarily think of what they are doing as an exercise in grammar." What do we think that means? So I'll go over that a bit again. So that some minds at some point discover that they can't make sense of their own predications, their own thoughts, their own thought processes without, let's say, attention to the grammatical construction of their thoughts.
They need to kind of speak something in words in order to properly understand it, maybe.
Yeah, so they need to speak something in words to understand it. That's certainly correct. I think Richard here is getting at something a little bit deeper, though. I think what he's getting at is you have to start to pay attention to how your thoughts are constructed in relation to one another. In the same way that we, fixated on diction, that's like the level of the word, right? Grammar, in a sense, is the level of the sentence. So now we are combining multiple conceptions, and depending on how you arrange them, you can actually come to very different let's say, meanings, different significations and uses. That's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about the subject-predicate relationships, but more importantly, when we talk about clausal connections. We know what sentence clauses are. Some people actually, I didn't realize this, but when I use the word clause, it's either like, a vicious animal tearing your throat out, or a man like breaking your house down your chimney. So, are we familiar with the concept of a sentence clause?
It's just like a part of a sentence, like maybe 3 or 4 or 5 words within a sentence.
That's more than, yeah, so 3 or 4 or 5 words, essentially a section, a phrase or section of phrases. That's a much better answer than I usually get, to be frank. That's much closer to what a clause is. We'll get to it here in time if my Discord doesn't make too many beeps there. All right, so let's go ahead to the next slide, though. We'll learn about the transition between clauses. Okay, so I mentioned, or rather Richard mentioned, that the grammatical constructions of your thoughts matter. Well, Lewis Carroll has a really fun demonstration of how much they matter. So we're going to read a little bit of Alice in Wonderland and see exactly what happens when you're not careful with the both grammatical and syntactic, I guess, the syntax of your sentence, though we won't cover syntax today. So I'll read. "Then you should say what you mean," the March Hare went on. "I do," Alice hastily replied. At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." Not the same thing a bit, said the Hatter. Why, you might as just well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. All right, go to the next one. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, which seemed to be talking in its sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. It's the same thing with you, said the Hatter. So, before we, I'll dive into this in a second, but I wanted to call some attention to that little bit in Alice in Wonderland, because all you have to do is reverse the arrangement of some words there, and all of a sudden you get an entirely different sentence. Now, why is that relevant? Well, we're talking about causal connections. We're talking about, let's say, ideas and, let's say, fractions or partially constructed ideas, like incomplete ideas. It's really a subordinate or a dependent clause. Where you arrange that and how you put it together can change an argument that you might be making, a claim about what is true, entirely. Have you ever had a conversation in which, let's say, you say something to somebody, and when they give you your idea back to you, they kind of like mirror it back at you, they've rearranged something in there, and then it has fouled up the whole idea. Has that ever happened to you?
It has, but I can't think of any particular examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure that's happened at some point in time.
Yeah, it's really easy to do. And so when they've done that and you've tried to point it out, did any of the people, because obviously this could have happened multiple times, did any of them insist that their construction of what you said is what you said?
Yeah, actually, I can't think of a situation that happened.
Oh, you got a particular example in mind?
Nothing I want to share.
No, you want to share? All right. No, I understand, because those type of arguments tend to get, at least in my experience, they've tended to get vicious very fast, because there's a misunderstanding between the two people. Okay? What is happening is one person is taking no heed to the grammatical construction of what you said to them, which means that they're losing information. Right? You don't think of it that way, right? Like, they've got all the words, they heard all the words, they think they understand, but then when when you say back to them, no, that's not what I said to you, I said this other thing. Well, it's like, yeah, that's what there is a vacuum, right? There is a place where new ideas are being prevented from entering in their mind because they are not giving proper attention to grammar. Now, when you think about writing, like, how much are you going to destroy your ability to write a coherent argument or a coherent essay if that happens to you? Think about it. Like, how many of those sentences you have to connect together to make the essay? Like, dozens and dozens and dozens. If it's a long essay, hundreds. And imagine not being able to tell the difference between those little adjustments. You're done for, right? At that point, either what you're going to end up writing is what I've gotten quite a bit teaching in undergrad, which is essentially you get a clause from one sentence and then another clause from another sentence. So this is like the first half of one, the second half of the other, and then there's like smushed together, like usually with a comma, but I've even had it be with like a period. So it's like, this is not even a sentence, period, not even also a sentence, like, so two sentence fragments. The punctuation is random. They don't know what they're doing. And then imagine, wait a minute, does that mean that that's happening in that person's head? And then that's a bit spooky. And then imagine how rare it is that you get someone who, if you just sat them down and made them write out their thoughts, that's what they would produce. So that's spooky. Or you get the other half of this, which is a rather eloquent, let's say, liar, someone who has developed the skills in order to kind of glaze over that happening all the time. So essentially, by clever use of rhetoric, they never actually have to make the causal connections, the transitionary, let's say, words and phrases make sense. They let's say, bamboozle you with, let's say, maybe particularly big words or emotionally evocative words. They just maybe throw out essentially the equivalent of, what would that be, pathos and not logos. What's the pathos, logos? Not eros, because eros is a different one. It'll come to me in time. The fact that it's embarrassing that I forget it right now on camera. But the point is that someone will gloss over the fact that that's missing. So talking about the normal person and what they think, we'll jump into the vulgar definition of grammar, right? So it's a body of rules to these people. Okay, it's a body of rules to us too, whose output is also all the sentences that are permissible. I've highlighted that word for a reason, in a given language, while excluding all those that are not permissible. I kind of have the answer here on the slide already. What's the problem with this? Grammar that's it's the rules that are permissible.
It assumes there's one standardized way of doing a language when there could be, I guess, a more creative way of doing it or something.
Oh yeah, well, certainly that's going to be different ways. Is exactly like that. That's right into the problem, right? So let's elaborate on what that means. So, if this is the case, right, then what it's suggesting is that all of the, let's say, rules are purely arbitrary. That there is no reference to anything that exists. But then, if that's the case, you would not be able to have common conceptions across languages, right? So we'll get into the elements later, but it's, nouns and verbs exist in all the languages. All of them. Why? Because persons, places, and things and ideas exist, right? And then actions are also something that are particular and exist. You can't just say it's like, well, verbs are an arbitrary social construct, and that's what's permissible by the authorities and those who have the power, man. Like, no, that doesn't work when this crosses time and space. It's too universal for that. So the problem with this definition is it relies way too much on authority. It essentially says there is an authority that says the thing is permissible, and that is what constitutes the rules of grammar, as if they just were handed down by someone who decided. I don't know how they decided this, because the grammar hadn't been constructed yet, apparently. But this idea that all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, I'm just saying this is the grammatical rules, and you can see how ridiculous that is, because before they dictated it, before whatever source of power dictated it, how were anyone communicating? It's very obvious that these things had emerged. So let's get into the technicality about this appeal to authority, which I don't know if in the series, I think I described a logical fallacy with the tautology, but it's worth reviewing. So if you're not familiar with the word fallacy, it refers to a form of rhetoric that, while seeming correct, usually has some form of non sequitur in it. At some point, it does not follow. So typically, the premises in a fallacy are true at each individual point, but either they go from one premise, one point to another, and you can't get there logically, or the conclusion reached is just not reached from the points that they've laid out. So this particular fallacy is an assertion or claim in which the beliefs of an authority on a topic are used as evidence to support that argument. The example I give here is, well, Confucianism is correct about what constitutes responsible conduct because, and that word because is important to this construction of grammar, because Confucius was a philosopher, which is an expert, an authority, and an expert, which is an authority, can't be wrong, so therefore, if Confucius believes it, it must be right, right? That makes sense? I can now bring, let's say, truth into being by believing it, because I have a particular social status. That's what that fallacy is doing. And we'll see an example of that with Zhangzi and Confucius here in a second. But before that, let's see. There we go. So this is Zhongzi, and then obviously we've seen Confucius before. Zhongzi is more of a title. I think Zhongzi, I can't, my Chinese pronunciation is horrible. And also Confucius isn't Confucius, by the way. I think it's like Kongse, or like Qin. There's a bunch of different names, but Confucius I think is a bastardization by the Jesuits. But everyone knows it, and I kind of like saying Confucius said. But yeah, Zhongzi. And see, go into the next slide. We can kind of see who's going to win the argument. All right, go into the next one. So, refuting the appeal to authority. Zhongzi said to Huizi, which I think was one of Confucius's best students, is Huizi. So in his book, he basically has himself verbally spar with Confucius's best student and then trounce him over and over and over again. But yeah, so Zhongzi said to Huizi, Confucius went along for 60 years and transformed 60 times. What he first considered right, he later considered wrong. He could never know if what he presently considered right were not 59 times wrong. And now, before we move on, let's think about what that means for a second, right? Because there's actually something profound when you start digging into what that means. So, not only can you not rely on an authority, because if even the authority, in this case Confucius, believes a thing, he believes something different, slightly even, than the year before, because he was learning, right? He kept up his education, right? Continuing, what do they call that? Continuing professional education in ancient China. But then what that also suggests is that you actually can't ever really establish anything on authority, because you never know when the paradigm is going to shift. I think Thomas Kuhn is the guy's name. He made famous this idea. Even with science, essentially, we'll have a theory that holds the most sway, which really means it has the most utility to us in terms of making predictions, right? But at some point, that theory will give way to a theory that essentially explains all of the things that prior theory did, and then a bunch of other things. This is like the shift from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, where things that, according to Newtonian physics, should be impossible suddenly are like, okay, our presuppositions that would suggest that that's impossible were wrong. Our model was wrong. So that's really what Zhongzi is pointing out here, is that you cannot, no matter how well established you think these ideas are, or how reputable an expert is, or an institution is for that matter, is really not, it is not reputable enough to tell you what is true. You still have to, be skeptical in the way that Descartes was and question what you think that you know. As a small aside, before we move on to the next slide, for those of you who might be students out there and you're writing something like a research paper, I want you to keep that in mind, or anyone actually, because nowadays we kind of are aware that you can't just believe what you are hearing on any media anywhere from any source. It doesn't matter. You kind of have to be what I call scientifically literate, but just able to reason well enough that you can vet sources for yourself. It's super important. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to go over how to do that in this lecture, but Zhongzi would approve of you being able to do that. All right, let's go to the next slide. So now we can get a real definition of grammar, or rather a useful definition of grammar. So I'm going to argue that, and this is going to get complex pretty quickly, and hopefully it'll expand and then come back down to something that makes sense. It's an abstracted system of rules explaining the logic of a given language. Okay, so an abstracted system, what does that mean? So think back to the philosophy of language and diction and language as cartography. So the philosophy of grammar is an evolution or an expansion. I kind of mentioned that before, how diction was the level of the word, and how essentially grammar is the level of the sentence. So we are taking what we've already learned in terms of language and diction in its, let's say, representation and accordance with concepts that then may or may not to a better or lesser degree accord with reality, and we measure that by utility. We're doing the same thing with grammar, but on a more general, broader scale. And that general, broader scale, that increasing in breadth, is called order abstraction. Have you heard of order abstraction before? A chance?
I don't think so.
No, it's not something a lot of people have heard of. I have not read it in the original sources, like the primary sources, but I believe from my research that it's essentially Thomas Aquinas' development off of Aristotle's work on talking about abstractions. So let's go to the next slide and we'll see what I'm talking about here. So what I'm familiar with and what I use quite a lot are three orders of abstraction. There's first, second, and third. Now, the first order is an abstract reference to a specific material thing. So if I say this desk, right, I mean this one particular here. Now, when I say this desk, the words this desk, it isn't the desk, right? That's a reference to a particular material arrangement or material substance. It's kind of like the shadow on the wall. Okay, so it's not the thing in and of itself, but my idea of it and my words for it. That's why I call it the map. But it's specific. That's important. And it's in reference to material or something of substance. When we go up to second order, I'm going up to category of material things. So instead of this desk, I have desks, right? Instead of my dog, like my pet Fido, I've got the concept of dogs. Okay, and so what I've done there is I've moved away from a particular arrangement of material to arrangements that really fundamentally what it is that you act in a certain way toward. And the dog example is a better one than the desk example, but we could do it with that. With the dog example, we don't just look at the morphology of the dog to know it's a dog. If you're just looking at the morphology, you would kind of get confused with other animals. There's other things that make a dog in the category of dogs. They make particular noises, they have particular behavioral patterns, right? They have particular sense organs that they use to navigate the world, particularly their scent and the way they sniff around all the time. They're of particular threat, right? They've got teeth, they're coordinated in a pack, so they pose a threat. That way they have utility to someone who trains dogs and uses them for either hunting or protection, or you have your dog as a companion. They have particular personality traits that make them different than, say, cats, right? Like dogs are all 100% enthusiasm and extroversion, whereas cats are not those things usually. So how you interact with the thing, that kind of ties into that aspect of language as cartography, as utility, being able to get you from point A to point B. Well, you know how to interact with most things in the world based on second order abstractions. Okay, now we have to get up to third order. Third order abstractions go even more general, and they no longer make reference to material, right? So if I say things that hunt in packs, like the action of hunting in a pack, that's not the same thing as saying dogs or wolves, for that matter. It's both dogs and wolves, and it might also be hyenas if they're hungry enough. But it's also lions. We might call them prides. Same idea, right? It's also humans. So now you see, once we get up to the third order abstract, we're really dealing with connotation, association. We are dealing with something that encapsulates many, many different subcategories within it. And when we think about what grammar is, grammar are those rules abstracted out from the language. So you have a particular language and you've got particular arrangements of words. Now those go into categories, like this idea of a sentence clause. So from a particular sentence, you get the idea of sentences and the, let's say, ways that those sentences represent and represent reality. Now we're at second order, right? Like the idea that you kind of an independent clause, and there's like almost an infinite number of arrangements of words that can make that type of clause. Now we have to be at least at second, because we're not something directly at first. But then what an independent clause is, right? Let's say that we'll get into it, but it's like a complete thought constituting subject and predicate. Now we're starting to drift even further closer toward a third order abstraction. So when I say that grammar is an abstraction of the logic of a language, that's what I mean. We are taking the particular reasons, or the particular coherence is better than reasons, of a language and how it accords with reality, and we are making a general explanation so that we can explain to ourselves how it is that our language relates to reality. All right, that was a long explanation, but order abstraction is stupidly complicated. It took me forever to understand it. Go ahead to the next slide. All right, now this is a little bit drier part, but we'll kind of speed through it. So these are just the elements of grammar. If you're not familiar, nouns and pronouns, persons, place, things, ideas, you guys should know that. Adjectives describe nouns, verbs or actions or states of being. There are certain verbs that are like linking verbs, so there's like is. I don't like that they are typically just called linking. It's like, no. What that type of verb is, it's saying that a thing is extant, and that extant is, in a sense, a form of action. And that's important because the way that we think, being itself may be considered an act, and that might become philosophically relevant, right? Think of like the trolley problem, like is not throwing the switch a choice. You see what I mean? That's why I want to call attention to that, right? Adverbs, they describe verbs. They do other things. They describe other adverbs, and there's more to this than what I'm giving, but we're going through quickly. Prepositions. This might not be super useful, but a lot of people struggle with what prepositions are. Look at the word preposition. It's a reference to like time and space, right? Where a thing is located in reference to other things, or when. So that might be helpful. Conjunctions are actually way more important because conjunctions contain a ton of information. You notice I used the word because earlier, right? We'll come back to that, but that means like as a consequence of, which is different than in spite of, or in contrast to, or in addition to. And if you know syllogistic logic, if you're familiar with that, those are not interchangeable. Like and or are not interchangeable words in syllogistic logic, which means they're not interchangeable in logic, which means if you're using them incorrectly, you're making massive degrees of error in your thinking. Punctuation, we won't spend too much time on it, but it does represent the breaks in those clauses, which is important because of the relationship between subjects and predicates. So you mentioned phrases. Those are essentially just groups of words, like small groups, units of words. Whenever we want to refer to like an idea that we describe with multiple words, it's a phrase. Subject and object, so that's like the agent and the thing acted upon or on the behalf of. We'll talk more about that as we go. Predicate, this gets complicated, so I didn't put the second subject. There's subject-object, and then there's subject-predicate. Now, subject-predicate is something that is rather simple, but what I've found is a lot of students I've had don't know what a predicate is in relation to the subject in the sentence. Are we familiar?
Predicate is it basically another name for the verb?
Sort of, yes. It is everything that is the way that the sentence is constructed, separate from the essence of the subject. Now, essence isn't a word that we use. Well, you might hear it, but a lot of people don't really think about what it means. That's getting kind of back to like ancient Greek philosophy, right? So you might arrange a sentence like, I don't want to spoil it. We'll get into it as we go, I believe, in this presentation, if not the next one. But sometimes I might say like the dog is lazy versus the lazy dog. In one of those constructions, laziness is a predicate to the dog, and the other one is of the essence of the dog. It is part of the subject. And that can matter, again, because you have to start paying attention. Is laziness actually of the essence of the dog, or am I merely constructing the sentence that way? And you can see why, if you're familiar with the various forms of essentialism, that would probably get me in trouble if I started to talk about it here on the recording. You could be thinking in an essentialist way when those things are actually not of the essence of the thing. And I have independent clauses, and I should also put dependent clauses, but it looks like I forgot. Doesn't matter because we're going to get into it anyway. Let's go on. Okay, so subject and predicate. We kind of talked about this before. Let's look at the examples, and that will clarify things. So in the former, or the upper example here, we have the subject in red. René Descartes considered the possibility that everything he believed really was the illusion of a demon. Okay, so the predicate is everything that René Descartes is doing, and all the description, let's say, being ascribed to what he's doing. And if there was something describing him back, that would also have been included. There just doesn't really happen to be. So let's compare that to the predicate. So it's a little cut off there by the shadow of the chair, but I can read it, so you'll hear. Immanuel Kant believed to have peered beyond the veil of human perception with his categorical imperative. So we've got Immanuel Kant, the subject, and his belief, and then everything describing that belief is, let's say, a predicate in relation to him, the subject. Like I said, this will matter more as we delve into the subject matter. We'll keep moving, though, to not get stuck on this dry material. Okay, so now we have the idea of a subject and a predicate. We can understand the difference between a complete and an incomplete thought, which, again, while dry, actually matters, because if you're thinking in incomplete thoughts, you're probably thinking in detached, incoherent thoughts. So what is a complete thought? It has to contain both a subject and a predicate. So a lot of people say it has to contain a noun and a verb, and that's generally, that's always correct. I think sometimes you can get away with having the noun implied, but it's still kind of present in the meaning, right? So it's not gone. So our example here, we've got Plato and Aristotle. Here is a compound subject, so you can have multiple subjects act as one subject. So Plato and Aristotle did not agree on key aspects of philosophy. Can't get away with just one or the other. You have to have both of those to have a complete thought. What about an incomplete thought? And I particularly picked a very long sentence that's usually used for, what is it called? Oh no, I adjusted it, I think. Yeah, so if you ever look at fonts, they'll have like the quick, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog or something, because it has all the letters of the alphabet. You'll notice I've played around with that. So, first example of an incomplete thought. It's lacking one thing or the other. The quick sprinting fox and the lazy sleeping dog. All right, so what's missing there?
No predicate, it's all subject.
Yeah, it's all subject. Even though there's description, this is why I mentioned that before, right? Like I've got a quick sprinting fox. Those are actions. Sprinting is an action. But sprinting isn't a verb in this sentence. You might think, well, why does that matter? Because to sprint is an action. No, I'm saying that when the fox I'm referring to, I'm only referring to when it's in a state of sprinting. So now that's kind of been put to the essence of the fox. So that's what makes it a subject. But there's nothing happening here. So the thought is incomplete. And I would get sentences like this quite often, teaching English composition. So there's a reason I'm spending time here. Let's look at the other half. Jumps over and digs under the white picket fence. Right? Obviously, this is lacking the subject. It's kind of, I'm giving it away with all the highlighting I've done here. But I wanted to show that it doesn't really matter how long it is. And it doesn't matter whether you think, well, that's kind of referring to an action. That's kind of referring to a subject, right? Like, there's a white picket fence, right? Isn't that, and now, well, it's an object, which is not the same thing as a subject. It's a thing being jumped or dug under or jumped over. But who's doing the jumping? Who's doing the digging? We don't know. It's not been said. And you might say, well, you should know because I just said in the prior sentence, which it isn't, right, that it's the fox or the sleeping dog. But the problem is you can't be that lazy because we've introduced an ambiguity between these two incomplete thoughts. That means that the person reading has to be a mind reader to properly interpret what you're thinking. And then also you have to assume that maybe you're consistently interpreting your own thoughts. Because it's very, you might have seen this with examples of heuristics being demonstrated with essentially dupes on the street, where they'll be, let's say, shown a picture. I think, what was it done? Maybe it was in New York, I can't remember, but they had pictures of different women, and they had random guys come by and say, like, pick the woman you think is the most beautiful. And they would pick one of the pictures, and the person would put the pictures away, and they would talk to them for a while, like distract them. Then they would flip over a different picture and ask them to describe why they thought the woman was beautiful initially. And they don't notice that the picture has changed, and then they will give their description according to the new picture. But remember, like, they had already seen and decided which one they thought was the most. So now they've changed their preference, their opinion, midway through a conversation without realizing it's happened. There's a bunch of other little psychological tests, like with the gorilla and the basketball team passing back and forth. If you guys know that one, you'll know it. But why am I bringing that up right now? I'm bringing that up because if you're thinking incomplete thoughts, that level of inconsistency is happening in your head. And so when you go to write it out, it's going to, what you're seeing is evidence of, it's a poor thinking. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. Let's see. Here we go. Independent clauses versus subordinate clauses. Now, why is this important? So now we're going to learn about which, clauses, which combinations of subjects and predicates can stand on their own, therefore constitute complete thoughts. And obviously it's going to be important to your writing, but also which kinds are not, which ones constitute incomplete thoughts, so that we can understand how to attach them together properly, so we can make our thoughts cohere in sequence with one another. So to not belabor the point, because I imagine a lot of you already know this, an independent clause is a complete thought. It's got a subject and a predicate that constitutes what's called a simple sentence. Example, Socrates was deemed the wisest man in all of Athens, right? So we got Socrates, he was, and what was he? Deemed the wisest man in all of Athens. It's long at the end there, but this is a simple sentence. A subordinate clause, there's a couple ways to make it. One way is to lack a subject or a predicate. There's another way, which is to add in a word that subordinates the clause. Like if I put the word while in front of something, like I could say, I'm walking into the gym. Okay, complete sentence. But if I say, while I'm walking into the gym, you can hear it. My voice automatically inflects because it suggests that what I'm saying is contextualizing some independent clause that it needs to attach itself to. But the example I have here is, Socrates was deemed the wisest man in all of Athens. Okay, so that's the independent clause, can stand on its own. In red down here, him being the only one who knew of his own ignorance. That's a subordinate clause, right? Because there, let's say, there is no subject. Him is an object form of he, right? So we're not referencing a subject here, even though someone might think that it is. If to them, the he and him forms are interchangeable. And why does that matter, right? Because again, it's just arbitrary rules. No. If let's say the subject and object forms of the pronouns are interchangeable, that means subjects and objects. It means agents and things acted upon are interchangeable in your head. That makes you extremely susceptible to particular forms of sophistry, which I've got a few that come to mind, but I don't want to get into political trouble. So we'll go to the next slide. All right. So to have a single, simple, complete, coherent thought, it must be articulable in a single sentence. This is kind of stuff I've already gone over, right? A sentence requires at least one independent clause. In other words, a sentence requires at least one complete thought. That's what a sentence is. A sentence is a complete thought. And that requires the subject and the predicate. We'll keep going. Okay, so more complex thoughts might require an additional independent clauses and or subordinate clauses in addition to the independent clause. And that makes sense, right? The more complicated the thought is, the more clauses you got to bring in because there's more information to relate to whatever the core information is that you're getting at. So there's compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. We'll get into what those are in particular. What's more important, though, is how we connect those. You have to connect them in the right way, or else you lose relational information, which I've talked about a bit earlier. So let's get into that. All right, so I mentioned there's relational information and how they're connected. This is done primarily through conjunctions and punctuation. Let's just blast through this slide, get some more examples. Okay, so basic rules. And I'm going to explain my explanation as to why these rules are the way they are. I won't spend too much time. Again, kind of dry. Compound sentences, two independent clauses that are attached together, right? You know that. You need a comma and a conjunction to do this. You could use a semicolon as well, but let's just leave that aside. For most, 90% of the time, maybe 95, maybe 99% of the time, you're going to be using a comma and a conjunction. Why do you need both? The comma is there to signify, let's say, in relation to the conjunction, the fact that you are breaking off into a different idea that is related to but independent of the one that came before, as opposed to, let's say, a complex sentence which has an independent clause attached to a subordinate clause. Or if you're attaching two subordinate clauses that are eventually attached to an independent clause, it works this way as well. It's the comma or the conjunction. Now, why or rather than both? It's because when you have a subordinate clause, the reason that it's subordinate is that it needs something more substantial to relate to for it to make sense. Without it, it's lacking a subject, or it's lacking a predicate to which the information is relevant. You kind of need to have an understanding of what relevant means there, right? So you can imagine that when you're constructing your sentences, there's really an infinite number of things you could say at any given moment. That's kind of why if you take someone who's not used to writing and you put them in front of a blank page and you say, okay, write an essay, and then they freeze. And then you kind of maybe you coax them into a particular topic to help them. And then they say, okay, I think I have that, and they go to write, and then they freeze again. Because when you have an infinite number of choices that you can make, you don't know which one to go with unless you already have, let's say, a value hierarchy, right? Which is kind of like, you get that by practicing writing and understanding what isn't successful at communicating your thoughts and what is, and then you can have a system of relevance. So that system of relevance, the fact that there is relevance, is why it's or one or the other, comma or conjunction, rather than it being both with the compound sentence. Compound complex sentences, to simply put, it's when you have an independent clause connected to a complex sentence, or you've got two complex sentences and it can be attached where the independent clause is attached. You have like a compound sentence with complexities added to either end. There's a bunch of different combinations. I think you get the idea. We'll go ahead and on. Okay, so we're going to talk about conjunctions for a second because this actually matters. I mentioned some of this before, so we don't have to take too much time. But these particular meanings matter. They matter a lot. If you get into it, again, we talked about syllogistic logic. I am unfortunately unprepared to just start going off and on syllogistic logic. But it's like if A then B, A then B, right? That type of thinking. Or if A and B then C, right? Well, that has and in addition to. If A in addition to B, then the result is C. This is given that that's true as an example. That's not the same thing as or, right? Because or is one and not both. Not both. You cannot have both and use the word or. So what that means, if I say A or B, it does not follow, it's a non sequitur to then conclude C if it's A and B to make C, right? Or but, so it's in contrast to. People like to pick on politicians for that, where they'll say, some long string of, platitudes. But everything I'm about to say is about to undo everything that I just concessed to you, right? But yet is pretty similar in spite of there's some other uses for yet, so they're not. It's not interchangeable with but you get the idea. We're moving in opposition to. So and because are more interesting, and the word for also is more interesting. So funny enough, right? I want to focus on because, which I think because technically isn't a conjunction, but it operates exactly like one, so I don't care that, let's say if you go open up a grammar textbook and go, well, that's not exactly right. Well, guess what? When you use it like one, it basically is, because that's how we decide what it is in the first place. So again, maybe I'll get lens flare laser eyes and I can like blast and burn through a textbook. But when I say because, I'm saying to be caused by, it's in the word, be caused, right? That's why the word because is what it is. Why is that relevant? Well, if I say like you did, let's say he stole the bread because he was poor, right? Is that why he stole the bread?
Could be a contributing factor, but probably not necessarily the main reason.
Could be a contributing factor. It could be a relevant factor.
Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. But is the word because the right word for that? To describe a relevant factor? Because I didn't say like he was poor and stole the bread. I said he stole the bread because he was poor. Right? Because what I'm implying something there. What am I implying about poverty?
Causation, you're implying that it causes thievery.
Yeah, right. I'm saying it causes thievery. Now, a lot of people, I bet when you heard that there's going to be a ton of people, and there's not going to be a ton of people to watch this, but if you are one of the lucky few who do watch this, might have heard he stole the bread because he was poor and thought no problem about that at all in your conception. Well, guess what? Bruce Lee here. Your thoughts are wrong. And they're seriously wrong, and wrong in a way that is actually terrible, because what in your brain, which has happened in the background in the realm of axioms, of being my own like Plato here, in the perfect realm of axioms, you assumed that poverty causes someone to steal, which means that you've destroyed any concept of free will or restrained free will or whatever you want to call it. That's now gone from your conception. Now we are conditional determinists. Well, what does that do to all of your concepts about morality? Are those starting to crumble around your feet? And then when those start crumbling, what else starts crumbling? And you realize that something as silly and small and stupid as the word because used in the wrong place can corrupt someone's entire conceptual system. And that's why I wanted to stop and focus here. Because it's funny because of how small this is, but misuse of conjunctions between the clauses, right? So he was poor, he stole the bread, right? Those are it's said that way, two independent clauses. Depending on how they connect those things, can utterly change not just the argument, but if you're not paying attention, all the arguments that you will then make as a consequence of accepting the one before. Or you're just going to be incoherent and then just, let's say, argue whatever happens to feel right in the moment. And like, good luck writing an essay doing that. You're not going to make it. So go to the next one. Okay, so this is all the different uses of punctuation. I don't want to focus too much on these. So we just won't. If you're watching here, you can pause the video, right, and then take a look. There's hardly any punctuation listed here. Maybe I'll give the M dash a shout out. Have you used the M dash before in your writing ever?
Yeah, I kind of use it in the same place as the colon. I don't know really.
Yeah, it's kind of cheating. It's literary cheating is what the M dash is. There's uses for it, but it allows you to break with the grammar in order to connect thoughts in a way that to connect them grammatically would be obtuse. You can't do it that way. Mostly, it's used a lot in older text. My message is, I encourage people to use the M dash. I also encourage people not to overuse the M dash, because once you start using it, you just want to use it everywhere. Okay, that's your public service announcement. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so we have some exercises here. Do I want to go through with all of these? We'll go through a couple, but we won't go through them all, right? This one's fun. She slapped me, blank. I failed to notice her ribbon. I don't know how many women are wearing ribbons nowadays. A little antiquated example, right? So what could we stick in here?
Because, maybe.
Yeah, so let's think about that. She slapped me as a consequence, or as caused by my failure to notice her ribbon. Yeah, sure, right? Like her impetus to do it was specifically my failure to notice. Let's see if we can play around with that and change what the meaning is entirely. What if I say, instead of because, I say, let's say, so. Because remember, so was like as a consequence of, but when you put it in here, that's not what happens, right? It doesn't do the same thing as because, right? As be caused by, right? So I have a slap as the causal factor was not noticing. But if I say so, she slapped me, so I failed to notice her ribbon. Now that doesn't mean the same thing, does it? My not noticing her ribbon is like revenge, like she slapped me, so I just pretended she didn't have that pretty ribbon on, right? Let's see, this next one is also kind of fun with that, right? So I wrote her a poem, blank, she still rejected me.
You can use but there.
Yeah, right, that's a natural inclination. Like I did this thing, but even though I did this thing, what I didn't want to happen happened. So like I put in a positive effort, still got a negative result. But it's perfectly simple, right? Yet, you can use yet for the same thing here, I believe. You might even be able to get away with and. Still grammatically correct, right? So like I wrote her a poem and she still rejected me, right? So technically you really should use but, that's better, but and isn't wrong. It doesn't change the meaning, right? Like both of those things happen. I wrote the damn poem and like got thrown to the waysides. What if, let's say, what other words can we stick in here, maybe make it weird? I wrote her a poem because she still rejected me. But that does mean something entirely different. But it's actually in a way in the same spirit, which is funnily enough, because it's like, okay, I'm taking another effort now in addition. So the ordering of the rejection comes. But the point is that depending on what conjunction you stick in there, you don't get the same idea coming out. That's really what I wanted these examples for. Let's go to the next slide. I think I have a couple more. I don't know how much. Yeah, these are punctuation examples. Just like I didn't really go over punctuation, I'm going to skim over these just for sake of time. So go ahead to the next slide if there's even anything left. All right, there's one more slide after this. What does all this mean? Go ahead. Okay, so to sum or summarize, grammatical rules are not arbitrary dictates, right? They are our attempt at describing and modeling reality in the same way we talked about with diction. So insofar as your thoughts are not grammatical, they're likely wrong, right? We talked about that with complete and incomplete thoughts and let's say being able to write complete sentences. So what's going to happen by wrong, I mean incoherent, and there's going to be lost information that needs to be referred to. So it's not wrong because, a lot of times they say wrong, it's like people are like, well, you just don't like it, man, right? Remember, belief, knowledge, and opinion. A lot of people, going back to the philosophy of diction, to them, opinion is the same thing as believing a thing to be, which is kind of like a twisted unconscious solipsism. You know what solipsism is? It's like you kind of believe you're in the matrix, but then unconscious meaning you just assume that you're in the matrix and don't know it. So it's like you took like the whole bottle of blue pills when Morpheus offered you one, right? Furthermore, subtleties of grammar make up the connective tissue between and among thoughts and can be used to mislead you. I showed you in some of our examples how I could do that by just changing one word, using the word because when I shouldn't. I could trick you into assuming a bunch of things aren't true, such as poverty causes thievery, which means all poor people are thieves. I could twist it depending on how I want. I could twist it all different ways, right? So you got to be on the lookout for that. Let's go into the next one. So for next time, we're going to cover syntax and style. So this is the significance of subject-object ordering, and that's going to be in relation to the style of writing. In particular, we're going to talk a lot about active and passive voice, which has all different kind of ways that you can be manipulative. And then we'll talk a little bit about stylistic elements, diving back into diction, because style is such a huge topic that we don't have time to cover it all. So we're just going to go back to diction and focus on that. All right, go into the shill slide. And if you enjoyed that, if you didn't know, I'm also an author of fiction, weird fantasy fiction. I've got my first novel in this series out right now, working with the next series of short stories out. So you should pick this up before I do that, so you've got it all read and can jump right in. One Smoke Broken, like a kind of weird fantasy with a Western-esque flavor to it. Lots of flintlock gunfights and evil occult magic. It's fun. Also went to Union and alchemical references. Also, I'm an editor. So I do freelance editing, proofreading, line editing, developmental editing. If you want to hire me, go to my website. You can find my book there as well, wildislet.com. Really appreciate you guys checking me out. I also really enjoy working with you. It helps me become a better writer, helps you get a better manuscript. You can get it ready, published. Or even if you're just a student and you need like someone to proofread an essay that you scrambled to write like the day before, and hopefully I'll catch it on my email. I'll get it back to you. Pay me like, I don't know, probably like $5 to $10 to do like a 2-page essay, and then I'm not going to do your essay, but I will make sure it's not full of grammatical errors, which is important because then you don't know what you wrote if it's full of grammatical errors. All right, guys, I think that's all for now. You guys have any questions before we go? No, this is a long one. Sorry to keep you so long, but I enjoyed having you, and I'll see you next time.